The idea of ice cream being a forbidden sin feels strange to us today. We see it as a simple pleasure. It's a treat for hot days, it's comfort food, but things change over time. What one generation sees as normal, another might have seen as a problem. Food, especially, has always had layers of meaning beyond just taste. Sometimes it was about health. Sometimes it was about religion. Sometimes it was about who you were in society. Well, we can look back and see how ice cream or things like it move through these different ideas. Long before anything we would call ice cream existed, people were already chasing cold treats. This goes back thousands of years. Think about ancient civilizations. They lived in hot places. They needed ways to cool down. Mountains gave them snow and ice. Smart people found ways to bring that ice down from the peaks. They stored it in special pits. These pits were insulated, they kept the cold in. This was a lot of work. It took many hands, it needed resources. So the ice and snow were precious. People mixed this precious cold stuff with other precious things. Honey was common. Fruit was too. Sometimes they added spices. This made a kind of slush. It was sweet and cold. These were not everyday foods. Only the very rich could afford them. Kings and queens enjoyed them. Emperors had them. They were a sign of power. They showed you could command resources. You could have something rare. In ancient Persia, they had something called sharbat. It was a fruit syrup. They poured it over snow. This was a treat. In China, around 1000 BC, they had a milk and rice mixture. They packed it in snow to freeze. This was an early form of frozen dessert. Alexander the Great was said to enjoy snow and honey. Roman emperors sent servants to gather snow. They flavored it with fruit and nectar. Was this a sin then? No, not really. The idea of sin often comes from religious or moral rules. These early icy treats weren't forbidden by gods or priests. They weren't seen as corrupting. They didn't lead people astray. Instead, they were symbols of status. They showed off wealth. They were a display. If anything, they might have been envied. But envy is different from sin. The biggest barrier was access. Most people couldn't get these treats. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the means to get ice. They didn't have the time to prepare them. So, for the vast majority, these icy desserts just weren't part of their world. They were too far removed. The common person might not even have known they existed. It was not a question of good or bad. It was a question of possible or impossible. The ingredients themselves were often simple. Milk, sugar, fruit. These were generally seen as good things. Milk was nourishing. Fruit was natural. Sugar, in its early forms, was a luxury too. It was not yet the cheap, widely available stuff we have today. Sugar was often used as medicine. It was a spice. It was a sweetener for the rich. So a dessert made with these high-status items was respected. It was admired. It was not something to feel guilty about. We need to remember the context of those times. Life was often hard. People worked physically demanding jobs. Food was mostly about survival. It was about getting enough calories. Treats were rare. When they did come, they were savored. They were appreciated. There wasn't much room for worrying about moral failings tied to a simple sweet indulgence. The focus was on living, on enduring. So in these very early days, the concept of a frozen dessert being a sin just didn't exist. It was an elite pleasure. It was a marvel. It was something special. It wasn't widely available enough to even generate a moral debate. People weren't questioning its place in society. They were just trying to get by. And if a ruler enjoyed a bowl of flavored snow, it was just another sign of their power. It was not a moral failing. It was a perk of being in charge. The sheer effort needed to make these things also played a role. Someone had to hike to mountains. They had to cut ice. They had to transport it. They had to keep it from melting. This was all before modern refrigeration. This kind of labor made the end product incredibly valuable. Value does not often go hand in hand with being a sin. Instead, it speaks to something revered, something to be sought after. It was an act of skill and dedication. It was not an act of moral weakness. And ice cream, as we might recognize it, slowly started to take shape much later. The story often connects to Marco Polo. He traveled to China in the 13th century. Some legends say he brought back recipes for frozen desserts. These might have included techniques for using salt to help freeze mixtures. This was a big step. It made it easier to create cold things without just relying on natural snow or ice pits. But even if Marco Polo didn't bring the exact idea, Italian chefs were very inventive. They were at the forefront of culinary arts in Europe. They began to experiment. They used ice and salt in tubs to freeze creamy mixtures. This was the birth of what we might call true ice cream. It was a slow process. You had to churn the mix by hand, in a container. That container sat inside a bigger one filled with ice and salt. The salt made the ice melt slower. It made it colder. This let the mixture freeze evenly. This new frozen dessert spread through Europe. It went from Italy to France. Catherine de' Medici, an Italian noblewoman, married the future King Henry II of France in the 16th century. She brought many Italian customs and dishes to the French court. Some stories say frozen desserts were among them. Later, in the 17th century, a Sicilian chef named Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli opened a famous cafe in Paris. It was called Cafe Procope. He served iced desserts there. These were very popular. They were still exclusive. In England, King Charles I supposedly offered his ice cream maker a lifetime pension. This was to keep the recipe a secret. He wanted ice cream to be his royal treat only. This again shows its status. It was a luxury, it was not something for everyone. And it certainly wasn't seen as a sin. It was a privilege, it was a delight. When ice cream came to America, it was still a rare find. Governors like Maryland's Governor Bladen served it in the early 18th century. George Washington had a fancy ice cream maker. He spent a lot of money on it. Thomas Jefferson even wrote down his own recipe for vanilla ice cream. He liked it so much. These were all powerful, influential people. They saw it as a fine dining experience. They did not see it as forbidden. The ingredients were still expensive, sugar was costly. Cream was not always easy to get in large quantities, especially fresh, and the process of freezing it took time and labor. It needed special equipment. This meant that only the wealthy could enjoy it regularly. For most people, it was still something they read about, if they even knew about it. It was a distant pleasure. So, through the 17th and 18th centuries, ice cream grew in popularity among the upper classes. It was served at grand dinners, it was a symbol of sophistication, it showed you were well-traveled. It showed you had taste, there was no real religious or moral outcry against it. It wasn't linked to vice, it wasn't seen as leading to bad behavior. Some might argue that any luxury or excessive indulgence could be seen as morally questionable by strict religious groups. But ice cream wasn't singled out. It was just one of many rich foods enjoyed by the elite. It didn't have the same negative connotations as, say, excessive drinking or gambling. It was a sweet treat, it was elegant, the main idea of sin around food often related to gluttony. That means eating too much, but gluttony applies to any food. It wasn't about the ice cream itself being bad. It was about the behavior of eating too much of anything. So, if someone ate too much ice cream, they might be seen as gluttonous. But the ice cream itself was not inherently sinful. In this period, ice cream was still mostly a private affair. It was made in homes of the rich, it was eaten at their tables, it wasn't something sold on the street. It wasn't widely available, so it didn't really enter the public square in a way that would provoke moral judgment from the general population or religious leaders. It was an item of class, it was a mark of distinction, it was a taste of luxury. And for those who had it, it was pure delight. It was not a forbidden pleasure, it was a celebrated one. The idea of ice cream as a problem, or even a kind of sin, started to show up later. This wasn't because of ancient religious decrees, it was more about new ideas on health, changing social norms, and concerns about purity. One big area of concern was health. In the 19th century, doctors and the public started to think more about what they ate. They didn't have our modern understanding of nutrition, but they had their own ideas. Cold foods were often viewed with suspicion. Some believed that eating very cold things could shock the stomach. They thought it could lead to digestive problems. Doctors sometimes warned patients against cold drinks and foods. They thought it could upset the humors of the body. This wasn't a moral sin, but it was seen as a health risk. And for many people, putting your health at risk was unwise. It was a kind of self-harm. Some might even say it was a neglect of the body, which could be seen as a minor sin by some religious views. Then there was the question of ingredients. Ice cream contains milk and cream. In the days before refrigeration was common, milk could go bad quickly. There were worries about impure milk. There were concerns about bacteria. Poor hygiene in early ice cream making could lead to sickness. If someone got sick from ice cream, it wasn't the ice cream's fault in a moral sense, but it added to a general feeling of caution. It made people wary, made it a food to be careful with. Some strict religious groups might have seen illness from impure food as a punishment or a consequence of not being careful enough. Sugar was another factor. By the 19th century, sugar was becoming cheaper. It was more available. But it was also starting to get a bad reputation. Some people saw sugar as an indulgence. They linked it to idleness. They thought it was not good for health. Too much sugar was seen as a sign of weakness. It showed a lack of self-control, and a lack of self-control was often tied to moral failings. Eating too much sugar was a form of gluttony, and gluttony was one of the seven deadly sins. So, a dessert loaded with sugar like ice cream could fall under this warning. It wasn't the ice cream itself, it was the sugar in it and the act of consuming it in excess. The temperance movement also played a role. This movement was against alcohol consumption. It was very strong in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Temperance reformers often promoted clean living. They encouraged people to avoid all kinds of vice. While ice cream wasn't alcohol, it was an indulgence. Some temperance advocates saw any unnecessary pleasure as a slippery slope. They thought it could lead to worse habits. For some, ice cream parlors became popular places to socialize that weren't saloons. But even then, some worried about the sheer pleasure of it. They worried about people spending too much time or money on frivolous things. There was also concern about the setting. As ice cream became more popular, parlors opened. These were public spaces. Young people went there. Unsupervised mixing of young men and women sometimes worried moral guardians. The parlors were not saloons, but they were still places of entertainment and social interaction. For those who believed in strict separation or limited social interaction, even ice cream parlors could be seen as places where young people might be tempted into bad behavior. It was less about the ice cream and more about the environment. So, while no major religion or moral code ever officially declared ice cream a sin, it certainly got caught in the crosshairs of changing societal values. It was seen as an indulgence. It was expensive, it had sugar, it was cold, it was sometimes made in unsanitary conditions. All these things made it a target for concern. For a strict moralist or a health reformer, eating ice cream might not be a direct sin, but it could be seen as a sign of weakness. It could show poor judgment. It could be seen as leading to gluttony. It could be seen as a waste of money. These were not direct condemnations, but they were certainly cautions. They made some people feel that ice cream, while not forbidden, was something to be approached with care. It was not an innocent pleasure for everyone. It had a hint of risk. It had a touch of excess. It felt a bit indulgent. And for some, indulgence itself bordered on the sinful. The world changed a lot by the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Technology made a huge difference. Refrigeration started to become more widespread. It wasn't just for rich people anymore. And ice harvesting and storage became more efficient. Then came mechanical refrigeration. This meant ice cream could be made and stored more easily. It became much more accessible. Industrialization also played a big part. Factories started to produce ice cream on a larger scale. This made it cheaper. It made it available to everyone. No longer was it just a treat for kings and queens. Now, a working class family could afford a scoop. This was a massive shift. Ice cream parlors popped up everywhere. They became popular social spots. They were places where people of all ages could gather. Young couples went there. Families went there. They served ice cream sodas, sundaes, and cones. The ice cream cone itself was a big innovation. It made ice cream portable. You could eat it while walking around. This made it even more democratic. How did this change people's views? For the most part, ice cream lost its sinful edge. As it became a common pleasure, it became normalized. It was no longer seen as an extreme luxury. It was just a sweet treat. The health concerns about cold food started to fade. People understood more about hygiene. They saw that most ice cream was made safely. The temperance movement, which had previously frowned on indulgence, actually saw ice cream parlors as a positive thing in some ways. They offered an alternative to saloons. They were wholesome places. They provided a space for entertainment without alcohol. So, what was once seen by some as potentially questionable indulgence now became a symbol of innocent fun. Ice cream became deeply woven into American culture. It was associated with childhood. It was linked to summer days. It was a treat after school. It became a symbol of simple, wholesome enjoyment. It was no longer something that needed to be whispered about or enjoyed in secret. It was celebrated. Still, some of the older ideas lingered. Some very strict religious groups might have continued to view any kind of rich dessert as leaning towards gluttony. Some health reformers might still have warned about sugar, but these were fringe views. They didn't represent the mainstream. For most people, ice cream was simply good. It was delicious. The idea of purity in food also changed. Instead of just worrying about bacteria, people started to think about ingredients. But even then, ice cream was generally seen as made from natural ingredients: milk, cream, sugar, flavorings. It wasn't seen as artificial or harmful. So the democratization of ice cream pretty much ended any widespread notion of it being a forbidden sin. It moved from an elite luxury, possibly eyed with suspicion by some moralists, to a mass market staple. It became a beloved part of everyday life. It was a simple pleasure that most people could afford and enjoy. It was part of the American dream in a small way. It represented abundance and joy. The stigma, if it ever truly existed beyond mild caution, completely faded. It became a symbol of innocent indulgence. It was something children begged for. It was a treat for special occasions. It was even something to share. It was a taste of happiness. The idea of anyone forbidding it or calling it a sin became quaint. It became something from a bygone era. No one was going to preach against a scoop of vanilla. It just wasn't that kind of food anymore. It had found its place as a universally accepted delight. Today, no one thinks of ice cream as a religious sin. You won't find sermons against it. No holy books forbid it. It's a dessert. It's enjoyed by billions of people all over the world. But the idea of something being forbidden or sinful sometimes takes on new forms. It reflects modern concerns. In our current world, the sin of ice cream isn't about God or the devil. It's often about our bodies and our health. We live in a time of extreme awareness about diet. We worry about calories. We think about sugar content. We look at fat. Ice cream, by its very nature, is often high in all these things. So the modern sin connected to ice cream is usually about guilt. It's about feeling bad after eating something rich and sweet. It's about breaking a diet. It's about not sticking to a healthy eating plan. People will often say, "Oh, I was so bad, I had a huge bowl of ice cream." Or, "'Tis is my cheat day, I'm going to sin with some ice cream." This isn't literal sin. It's a playful way of talking about indulgence. It's about going against self-imposed rules. The diet culture is strong. It tells us what foods are, good and bad. Ice cream often falls into the bad category. This can create a sense of moral failure, even if it's just a personal one. We judge ourselves. We feel like we failed if we eat too much of it. This is a very different kind of forbidden. It's not a priest telling us it's wrong. It's our own internal voice, shaped by advertising and health trends, telling us to feel guilty. We also see concerns about where our food comes from. Some people worry about the environmental impact of dairy farming. Others think about the ethical treatment of animals. These are modern moral questions. If ice cream is produced in a way that doesn't align with someone's values, they might choose to avoid it. This isn't about ice cream being inherently sinful. It's about the broader system it comes from. So while the explicit, formal sin status of ice cream never really existed in a widespread way, the idea of caution or restriction has always been there. In ancient times, it was restricted by access, it was too expensive, it was too hard to make. Only the elite had it. It was a luxury, not a vice. Later, as it became more available, it faced different kinds of scrutiny. There were health concerns about cold food, there were worries about hygiene in production, there were moral objections to excessive sugar and general indulgence. Some reformers might have seen it as a symbol of frivolous pleasure, a distraction from more serious matters. These weren't outright bans, but they were certainly calls for moderation. They were warnings against excess. They made it something to think twice about, not just blindly enjoy. But through all of it, ice cream adapted. It became a beloved treat. It shed most of its negative associations. Today, the only sin is a personal one. It's the moment of delightful surrender to a sweet craving. It's the small act of rebellion against a strict diet. It's a purely human struggle with self-control, not a divine condemnation. So no, ice cream was never truly a forbidden sin in the way some vices were. It wasn't something that would send you to hell, but it has been seen at different times and by different groups as problematic. It was exclusive. It was unhealthy. It was too indulgent. It was a waste of money. These were all forms of forbidden in a social or personal sense. But in the end, ice cream almost always wins. Its simple pleasure is too strong to be kept down. It remains a sweet escape, a moment of joy that people are willing to sin for in the lightest possible way.